So I want you to picture something in your mind right now. Just, visualize it.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. You're watching this massive military parade on your television screen.
Right.
You see these colossal tanks rolling down a wide avenue, and their treads are literally shaking the pavement.
Oh, yeah, the classic footage.
Exactly. You see intercontinental ballistic missiles on display, just these massive metal tubes moving slowly past the cameras, and, column after column of soldiers marching in rigid, perfect synchronization.
That's quite the spectacle.
It is. But when you see those images on the news, what is your immediate, gut reaction, first thought?
Probably that it's a show of power.
Right. A show of power, a geopolitical threat, a very deliberate flex of national muscle.
Well, yeah, and that visceral reaction is entirely by design, but it's a design interpreted through a very specific cultural filter. I mean, it is the visual language of military might, right? It's intended to look impenetrable. But looking at an event solely through the lens of, the present moment, it often blinds us to its actual foundation.
Which brings us to today's deep dive.
Exactly. If we want to understand the true psychology of this event, the May 9th victory parade in Russia, we have to consciously decouple the headlines of today from the historical memory of 1945.
And just to be super clear before we dive into the sources, we need to set some ground rules here.
Yes, absolute, Pershal. Look, we are not here to take sides or endorse a political viewpoint or validate any current geopolitical actions.
Right. That's not what this is about.
Not at all. Our goal today is strictly to unpack the specific historical and emotional narratives presented in today's source material. We're exploring how historical memory is constructed and, actually experienced by the people.
Yeah, and our main guide for this is the work of a social scientist named Chandrasekhar Singh.
Right, Chandrasekhar Singh.
Because his analysis completely reframes what is actually happening beneath all that armor and uniform. He argues there's this massive disconnect between what is broadcast globally, especially in the West, and what is actually felt by the people on the street.
Yeah, and we see this disconnect most clearly in the mechanics of media framing. Like when Western media, and Singh specifically points to German media in his analysis here.
Right.
When they cover the May 9th parade, the broadcast is almost exclusively tightly cropped on the rolling military vehicles, the rockets, the weaponry.
Yes, the hardware.
Just the hardware. And by narrowing the focus purely to the hardware, the broadcast inherently tells a story of a looming modern threat. It frames the nation as an aggressor, demonstrating its strength to intimidate the West.
It makes me think about how much audio dictates the mood of a visual.
Oh, like in movies.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you take a horror movie and completely mute the terrifying soundtrack and you replace it with, cheerful pop music.
The killer walking down the hallway suddenly looks ridiculous.
Right. Not scary at all. You've changed the entire genre of the film just by altering the context.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks. And the media is essentially doing the reverse here.
Right.
By muting the deep generational grief that surrounds this parade, they cut out the actual audio of the event.
Yeah, they really do.
And all we are left with are the intimidating visuals of the weapons, which completely changes the genre of the parade from, a memorial to a threat.
And that is a highly effective way to understand the mechanism of erasure.
Erasure.
Yeah, because when you mute the grief, you completely silence the unimaginable suffering of the Soviet people during the war.
Right.
You erase the context of this desperate fight for national survival. Singh focuses heavily on the sacrifice and the suffering of the Russian people. I mean, we are talking about a demographic collapse on a scale that is almost impossible to fully comprehend today.
Just staggering numbers.
27 million lives lost, entire cities reduced to ash. And, this wasn't just a standard military conflict over borders or resources.
No, not at all.
It was a war of extermination, all because of the German war of aggression under the National Socialist regime. When that historical reality is removed from the broadcast, the modern viewer is left completely unmoored from why the parade even exists in the first place.
Right. But, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Let's challenge Singh's premise. Because the friction point here is the symbolism itself. If the primary goal of this day is mourning, and it is truly about remembering the millions of victims of a horrific invasion, using a tank as the centerpiece is a really aggressive tombstone.
I see what you're saying.
Right. Why not just light candles? Why not have silent vigils in town squares the way most nations commemorate their war dead? Having an intercontinental ballistic missile roll down the street just doesn't read as a typical expression of sorrow.
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the specific mechanism of survival during the Eastern Front.
Good.
For the Soviet population, survival required the complete restructuring of society around the production of that very hardware. Yeah. When the invasion began, the civilian population literally dismantled entire factories piece by piece. They moved them thousands of miles past the Ural Mountains and rebuilt them in the freezing cold.
It's just wild to think about.
You had women, children, the elderly working 18-hour shifts on starvation rations just to forge the steel for those tanks.
So, the tank isn't just a weapon that the military bought. It is like the physical manifestation of civilian defiance.
Precisely the point Singh makes. The machinery was the literal physical barrier between the civilian population and total annihilation. The tank is forged from civilian blood and sacrifice.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, in the context of May 9th, the military parade is not a display of modern strength or a threat of future conquest. It is a visceral representation of the suffering endured to prevent extermination.
That completely flips the script.
It really does. The military apparatus isn't there to say, look how strong we are today. It is there to say, look at the sheer unimaginable cost of what we had to endure to survive.
Which means we have to stop looking at the monolithic army and start looking at the human beings inside the uniforms.
Exactly.
If the tank is a symbol of civilian sacrifice, then the soldiers marching alongside it are representations of a lost generation.
And that lost generation created a sociological phenomenon known as post-memory.
Post-memory.
Yeah. This is what happens when a trauma is so massive, so all-encompassing, that it transfers to generations who never actually experienced the event. The trauma becomes the baseline reality of the culture.
Right.
Singh emphasizes a staggering historical reality here. There was not a single family untouched by the grief inflicted by that invasion. Every single family tree had branches violently hacked off.
You know, we throw words around like devastating or unprecedented so often in modern news that they completely lose their gravity.
They really do.
But to understand post-memory, you have to visualize an entire nation where literally every single household has an empty chair at the kitchen table. You have to picture the sheer density of a grief where every apartment building, every farm, every factory is missing fathers, brothers, and sons.
The demographic void was absolute. In 1945, there were villages in the Soviet Union where virtually no able-bodied men returned.
None.
None. You had an entire generation of women who had to rebuild a pulverized country with their bare hands because the men were buried in mass graves from Stalingrad to Berlin.
And when you read the primary accounts from that era, the sheer scale of the heartbreak hits you in these incredibly intimate, quiet moments.
Yeah.
It's not just about troop movements and battlefield tactics. You read about the train platforms in 1941. You have to picture the sad parents and the sisters weeping on those platforms.
It's just gut-wrenching.
Clinging to young men in ill-fitting uniforms, knowing the statistical reality that they were likely saying goodbye forever.
The physical act of letting go of your child into a meat grinder where life expectancy on the front lines was sometimes measured in weeks. The terror in that moment is absolute, and it was a terror replicated millions of times over.
There is a specific narrative thread Singh highlights that really grounds this in the human experience. It's the story of the abandoned fiancés.
Oh, yes. That part is incredibly moving.
Right. The young soldier standing on the platform who promises his fiancée that he will be back soon. He tells her, I'll be back in a few weeks or maybe a couple of months so we can finally get married.
And he leaves her with that promise.
Yeah. And the tragedy of May 9th is the memory of the millions of abandoned fiancés and widows who waited and waited.
They waited weeks, which turned into months, which turned into years.
Just waiting.
Waiting in a country that had been bombed back to the Stone Age. They endured starvation, freezing winters, and the grueling labor of rebuilding, all while holding on to a promise that would never be fulfilled. For those widows who waited and waited, the promise of soon turned into a lifetime of absence.
That unending wait is the invisible weight of the parade. Every uniform marching past the grandstand represents one of those broken promises. Every vehicle represents the desperate, bloody defense that cost those young men their futures.
Yeah.
And when you view it through that lens, you realize it is absolutely not a geopolitical flex to the people watching it. It's an annual funeral procession for a lost generation.
And this brings us to one of Singh's most provocative and vital arguments regarding how the West interacts with this grief today.
Okay, let's dive into that.
Singh points out a profound historical flattening that occurs in modern discourse. By focusing entirely on modern posturing, Western media often minimizes or completely airbrushes out the massive role that German fascism played in necessitating this defensive posture in the first place.
It's a convenient amnesia.
It is a highly curated amnesia. Critics highlighted in Singh's work argue that history is frequently framed in modern reporting to make it seem as though, today, the Russians are solely the perpetrators, and the West is purely the historical victim. Yeah, and this narrative completely sweeps under the rug the fact that the Soviet Union bore the absolute brunt of the casualties in the European theater.
Right. The numbers are just insane.
80% of the Wehrmacht's casualties occurred on the Eastern Front. The Soviet people essentially acted as the shock absorbers for the entire global war machine. And yet there's this dynamic today still blaming the Russians for their own suffering.
That is just, it's a massive blind spot.
It is. And Singh makes a fascinating, almost shocking point about the global debt owed to that sacrifice, speaking from his own perspective as an Indian social scientist.
Oh, right. This part was fascinating.
He argues that the suffering of the Russian people during the war of aggression wasn't just a regional tragedy. It was a sacrifice that dictated the fate of the entire world.
He is incredibly blunt about the stakes.
Very. Singh notes that if the Soviet Union had not absorbed the catastrophic blow of the Nazi onslaught, the trajectory of the entire globe would have fundamentally shifted. He states that without that specific sacrifice, he, as a man born in India, might very well have grown up with German as his mother tongue.
That completely reorients the map.
Doesn't it?
It forces you to realize that the geopolitical reality we all live in right now, the languages we speak, the freedoms we take for granted, are built directly on top of those 27 million Soviet graves.
Which is why the modern media framing is not just inaccurate, it is a profound insult to that foundational trauma.
Right.
When modern German media, for instance, broadcasts the May 9th parade purely as an aggressive threat against Europe while conveniently ignoring the fact that it was their own historical war of extermination that created the trauma being memorialized, it distorts history.
It really does.
It takes the victims of one of the most horrific onslaughts in human history and, in the context of this specific memorial, strips them of their right to mourn their own dead without being labeled a threat.
So, the danger here isn't just lazy journalism or like a biased camera angle. The danger is that we are entirely misreading the room on a global scale. If we treat a sacred funeral procession like a pure military threat, we are going to base our own modern geopolitical responses on a complete misunderstanding of the cultural psyche we are dealing with.
And that is the ultimate tension Singh asks us to confront. It is extraordinarily difficult for the human brain to decouple a symbol from its most immediate, present-day context.
Yeah, of course.
When an average media consumer sitting in Berlin, Paris, or New York sees a T-34 tank rolling down the street, their instinct is to associate it with current conflicts. The cognitive dissonance of seeing a weapon of war and being told to interpret it as a symbol of profound vulnerability and grief. That's a heavy lift.
Well, because the symbols overlap so perfectly, right? The tank is both a historical memorial of survival and, in other contexts, a tool of modern statecraft.
Yes. And separating the past from the present requires active, rigorous, critical thinking. You have to consciously choose to look past the superficial visual.
And it takes work.
It does. But the alternative is far worse. Allowing a nation's foundational trauma to be erased simply because it doesn't fit neatly into a tidy 2-minute modern news segment is incredibly dangerous. It leads to a fundamental dehumanization of an entire population.
It demands a much higher standard for our own information diets, doesn't it? We have to recognize that when we consume international news, we are rarely getting the raw event.
Almost never.
We are getting a highly curated narrative, filtered through the specific geopolitical anxieties of the broadcaster.
Singh's research serves as a stark warning against oversimplifying history. He urges us to listen to diverse perspectives and to relentlessly question how media outlets choose to report on historically scarred events.
Right.
You have to hold multiple truths in your head simultaneously. The hardware on display can be intimidating to a modern observer, while at the exact same moment, the people marching alongside it are engaged in a profound, deeply genuine act of collective mourning. Mourning for a war of extermination they barely survived.
So we started this deep dive, looking at rolling tanks and missile launchers, seeing exactly what the cameras wanted us to see, a monolithic, impenetrable display of power.
Yeah.
But by applying Chandrasekhar Singh's sociological lens and truly engaging with the mechanics of this historical trauma, we've stripped away that metal filter.
We've uncovered the human engine driving the machinery.
Exactly. We've seen the sad parents on the freezing train platforms. We've seen the abandoned fiancés, the widows who waited and waited decades for young men who bled out in the snow, all because of the German war of aggression.
It really puts it into perspective.
It does. We've recognized that the May 9th Victory Parade, beneath the armor and the rigid formations, is a nation openly mourning its devastating losses. It is a society carrying the visible, generational scars of an invasion that forever altered the demographic and psychological landscape of their country.
And it reminds us that true knowledge isn't just about accumulating facts. It is about having the courage to use those facts to dismantle our own initial assumptions. It is about recognizing the human element in places where the media only shows us metal.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over long after you finish listening.
Let's hear it.
When you watch international events unfold on your screen tonight or tomorrow, consider how much of what you're absorbing is the actual lived experience of the people on the ground, and how much is the narrative lens of the broadcaster.
Right.
If you started viewing the national holidays, the parades, and the rituals of other countries, not as statements of their current political ambitions, but as maps of their deepest historical scars, how would that change the way you understand the world?